we have with us the professional management consultant of Orange and Bronze. She also started her career here 8 years ago in Orange and Bronze as a business analyst. To share with us the key competencies to build an efficient and effective IT business analyst, please welcome Ms. Michaelle Tabilin.
Thank you, Ayn. And good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? If you could, please. All right. Thank you for confirming. So, as Ayn mentioned, I'm Mitch. I'm a professional management consultant here in ONB. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about myself and basically contextualize the topic that I've chosen for today that I wanted to share with everyone in the room. So I thankfully also mentioned that I started my career here 8 years ago in IT in particular, but overall I've been working for 10 years already or 11. The pandemic really did a big shift in the space-time paradigm of my mind. But I started my IT career here in ONB. I was working before as a research analyst in FactSet, which is a financial company. And how I transitioned into IT back then was that I became a POC for an internal automation project. Back then, I didn't even think about the word automation. I just know that they wanted to do some adjustments in the process that we were making, and then they tapped me as the one who would be doing the business requirements, providing them what we are doing. And the first time that I encountered the phrase test plan creation was also during that project. So suffice to say, even though I studied business administration in college and started working in finance, being exposed in these projects and tasks of a business analyst made me, captivated me into what later on would be a long career of being a BA, into a product specialist, product owner. I've even been a manager at some point, and now I'm a project manager here in ONB. So that's where I'm really going to get the topics that I would be sharing with everyone from. Like, these are the competencies that I think if you're someone who would like to start a career as a business analyst, who is considering shifting into a business analyst career, or even going beyond the business analysis role but would like to build on the foundations of business analysis, these are the competencies that I think would be best to start with, or at least should be present in order for you to claim that you've built enough to be called a business analyst and an expert in that field. But first, before we go there, I think this is a common contextualization practice is always to provide definition just so everyone is also aligned. So I took the definition of a business analyst from IIBA's BA Book of Knowledge, which is something that I entice everyone who would like to start on their BA careers also to check as a resource. So according to BA Book of Knowledge, a business analyst is someone or anyone who performs business analysis tasks. So what are those tasks? In a nutshell, these tasks involve discovering, synthesizing, and analyzing information from a variety of sources. So take note that it's a variety of sources. It's mentioned there, and I hope I would also be able to tap into those different sources later. And BAs are also the ones responsible for eliciting the actual needs of stakeholders. So it's important for us to remember that it's the actual need of the stakeholder. So sometimes, stakeholders would come in, similar to what Adam mentioned earlier. Sometimes they would already have this big stack of requirements that they just want us to process, quote-unquote process, develop, and deliver. But as a business analyst, you don't containerize your tasks or your role into just receiving these requirements. You also have to make sure that you are eliciting the actual needs of the stakeholders. So, since I mentioned in my title that I'll be talking about competencies, I also wanted to define and differentiate what competencies are versus skills. So, I've checked in various resources. It would be, it's in my notes. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to put it there. But it also includes IIBA's competency model. Competency is made up of knowledge, skills, and behavior. So this is the best way I think we could illustrate that. You have the knowledge, you build on that by improving your skills, and then it also matters how you behave or how you basically materialize those skills with your stakeholders. And having this layered sort of onion on top of the knowledge and skills and behavior, this is what builds your competency. So, for example, if you're trying to say that you have competence in requirements gathering, you should have at least the knowledge in what the requirements gathering techniques are. So, for example, you know what an interview is, you know how to conduct workshops or what is the difference between those. And then in terms of the skill, you should be able to like know how to select which one is the most apt. So, it's like applying those things, those techniques. So it doesn't matter even if you have memorized in your mind what the different techniques are. But if you don't know what to or how to select the proper one, depending on the circumstances you're in, you can't really claim that you have the skills of those techniques, right? And of course, it also matters your behavior towards that knowledge. So if you say that you are doing constant requirements gathering because you see that, you acknowledge that requirements always evolve, but you're not someone who consistently does documentation, meaning you just do the technique, you selected the correct one, but the value of doing those techniques, you weren't able to capture whatever those values are, which is the documentation, then it's not really a competency that you've built for yourself yet. And it means that you'll have to grow or identify where you could improve on this competency. So that's basically the context of how I came up with the different competencies and the different skills also that we will be tackling moving forward. So I hope it's also clear, but if you have any questions, you can leave it out later at the end of the session. All right. So, of course, I was thinking, why would I want people to learn what these so-called competencies are for BAs? I think first and foremost, especially if you're a BA, are there any BAs here except for Isa? All right, so you can just share this with other people. But even if you're not BAs yourselves, I think it's still important, especially if you're working closely with business analysts. So primarily, if you're a BA, learning these competencies or what these are would help you identify what your strengths are and what your room for improvement are. So it's very similar to like whatever role you're in, learning the competencies that would make you like an expert on your field would really help you identify these strengths and rooms for improvement. So of course, obviously, it also helps build your career progression and the people around you as well. So even if you're not directly a BA, but if a BA is working, for example, for you, it would be easier for you to have a basis on how to evaluate their performance because you know that they are or they are not yet competent in such fields. And of course, even for example, for headhunters, recruiters, it helps you know which candidates are suitable for the role of the business analyst. So in particular and throughout the lesson, of course, I'll be talking about IT Business Analysts. You would see from the BA Book of Knowledge that actually it's not really always limited to IT, but of course, I can't really speak for the whole like business analyst. So just to set the expectation of everyone, the context is within the IT industry, of course. All right. So for this session, I've identified 4, and honestly, there are many more competencies that can help you build your career in being an IT BA. But I wanted to focus on 4 for now. So primarily, I'll start with planning and organizing, which honestly is something that I think every BA would start with. And then, of course, there's requirements management, the analysis of those requirements, and finally, managing your stakeholders as well. So for planning and organizing, mainly it's maximizing time to gather sufficient data. In terms of requirements gathering, management, it's more of keeping track of changing requirements. I think Adam tapped on that earlier. Requirements constantly change as well. In terms of requirements analysis, I would say that this is the core of being a BA. It's literally there in the name business analyst. So the analysis itself involves a lot of things. And I've only identified a few that I think would be very helpful to whoever you're working with as a BA. And last but not the least, definitely, is of course stakeholder management. So you want to ensure that there's collaboration and engagement with your stakeholders, and it doesn't happen just at the start or at the end. So there's always that collaboration and engagement. So to start with, planning and organizing. So I mentioned that this is all about maximizing time to gather sufficient data. So I say sufficient because you can't always exhaust everything at one session. So, I mean, you can't force people to stay with you 24 hours just so you would be able to get all the data, right? But in every session and in every, say, meeting that you set or workshop that you set with your stakeholders, what matters is that you are able to gather sufficient data that is valuable in terms of how the requirements should be that will be used by the rest of the development team. So in terms of time management, it's really important to identify and involve the relevant stakeholders. So I want to emphasize the part of relevant stakeholders because basically, if we recall what a stakeholder means, it means anyone who has a stake on, let's say, the product or the solution, right? But if we're going to consider that anyone in the, let's say, the company or the enterprise could claim that, I have a stake in that because that affects this process and so and so. So in order not to be overburdened, and for you to say that you are actually good in planning and organizing, you should also be able to identify who the relevant stakeholders are for a particular session that you want to set. And then you also have to identify the time needed from the stakeholders. This is really important. It seems like it's a petty thing, but based on experience, most of the stakeholders would usually express their appreciation in terms of setting up the correct time that you take away from them, basically. Because one, they are still sacrificing part of their time, but on the other hand, the time that they sacrifice means that they would be able to get a lot more value in the future, and there's like a valuable ROI for them. So in terms of the time needed, sometimes it might take the whole day, especially if you're towards the start of the project where everything is just coming in, the picture is not yet that clear. For example, in the Mona Lisa picture that Adam shared earlier, you're probably at the top left tile yet. So if you want to have a bigger or a clearer idea of what the requirements are, it might take longer time. But as you move forward in the, say, in the engagement or in the project, you could identify the recurrence of sessions and then have shorter time frames for those. So it's really important as a BA because it also shows that you respect the time of people. So showing them that you have time management is very important for them. And then the techniques, which is something I touched a bit earlier when I did an example of the competencies. So you also have to identify what is the most suitable technique for requirements gathering session. So again, if you're towards the start of the project, you could do workshops. We actually do that as well for our clients that we started to engage with. And it's usually very helpful because, they usually have the freedom to let you know, this is the process that we are imagining, or this is the process that we currently have, and this is the process that we want to go. So the as is and the to be that they want to have, which is really, really helpful in identifying what they want to achieve in the future. But there are also some, wait, sorry. Yeah, but there are also some other types of requirements gathering techniques, which based on my experience was also really helpful to me throughout. For example, interviews and shadowing. So it's not mutually exclusive. Usually they come hand in hand. So if you have someone, especially if it's a really new project and you have no idea, the best case usually is to identify someone, ideally a user of the solution that you are going to build or you're trying to improve. Basically, it's a representation of like the persona that Adam talked about earlier. Shadow them, don't stalk them, just shadow. Identify the process that they are doing, document that, and then with that, you could ask questions already. So it's sort of like an interview session with them already as well. And of course, if you did your proper time management, they would also feel like empowered and heard with whatever concerns that they may have in the process that they are doing, which you can consider as requirements as well. So, of course, there's also email. We don't want to discount that. There are some times wherein simple questions could be asked via email or chat, especially if you also consider the time of the stakeholders wherein they're not always that available all the time. So yeah, I won't discount emails. Sometimes it's better to send emails than, set a meeting. I've experienced having someone scheduled a meeting with like 20 participants and, we just all answered one question at the same time and it felt like this is something that could have been an email. Yeah. So that's still requirements gathering. As long as you gather sufficient data, as we mentioned earlier, that's still a technique. Right. So I'll go now to the second competency, which is requirements management, which is still very much related, of course, into planning and organizing. So this part would be more of keeping track of changing requirements. So you've heard about making sure that you identify the relevant stakeholders and then you identify the correct techniques. And it's not like mutually exclusive that for this project, we're only going to do this specific technique or we're only going to do every 2 weeks. It could always change as long as you are able to organize those things. But again, it also matters that you also have a documentation which you can keep in terms of what the requirements are. Because as I mentioned earlier, the value that you will be delivering always comes from the data or the requirements that you're gathering from your stakeholders. So one thing that I usually think about in terms of documentation is that it should be sufficient as well. So what does it mean? There are times wherein people would usually focus on documentation, and we all know that in the agile we don't really usually focus on the documentation because we focus more on the working software. But there are instances wherein you can't really set aside having a documentation. And these are the considerations that I've encountered so far. So most of the time, there are companies who really have their own documentation policies. And this usually comes hand in hand with the succeeding bullet points as well. So there might be regulatory requirements on why we keep such documentation. there are times wherein the team isn't mature enough, for example, to just rely on user stories, and they would like to see more detailed documentation. And then there are also times when companies would have their external auditors or even internal auditors in their IT teams that would look at what is the process that we have for example, for credit card payment, because we want to know, because it impacts data privacy of customers and such. So it's always important, if you're a BA, to contextualize and, identify what are the certain factors that would tell me what kind of documentation I have to maintain. And for the next one, it's somewhat related to what Adam also shared earlier, prioritization. But this one, again, this is more on the scope of the evolving requirements that we have. So in terms of prioritizing what you have to elicit, for example, or validate with your stakeholders, the two things that I usually consider are whether the company's goals changed. Is there something that needs more attention now in terms of refining the requirements? And the requirements themselves, in terms of, for example, there's a regulatory change, or there really is a difference now compared to yesterday, for example. There might be those factors that would tell us how to prioritize what we want to elicit or refine in our backlog. So again, this is not necessarily the same as prioritizing the backlog itself, because I would expect that the product owner would have better say on that. But as a business analyst, you can't do everything all at once, just as what Adam also mentioned earlier. So you also have to prioritize what you think would give the most value to the company. And that would depend usually on these two things. So those are planning and organization and requirements management. So it's really more of sort of coming together now. And the next part, I would say, is the core of our being as a business analyst. Because as I mentioned earlier, the name itself is there. If you're a business analyst, you should be expected to do some analysis, not just documentation, not just gathering, not just doing sessions. You have some value that you could contribute to the company. And that comes in by doing the analysis itself. So two major things that I think are important or are relevant when it comes to requirements analysis would be problem solving and visualization. So I mentioned earlier, problem solving. Sometimes companies would come in, they think they already have the requirements written out, and you just have to do it, but it's not always the case. So as BAs, part of our reason for existing is making sure that we are solving the right problem statements. So I'm not saying that they are wrong problem statements, but in terms of identifying what the problem really is, and be able to provide an actual value versus just a perceived value, you should be able to identify the correct problem statement. And as much as possible, the goal also is to identify the root cause. Because usually, if you have the problem and you identify the root cause, it leads to a more valuable solution for you. So it also lets your stakeholder know as early as possible that, if you ran through a red light, it's not because you're late for work, but it's because you forgot to check it. So we have to address that problem. How do we ensure that you won't forget to check it, for example? So the 5 whys technique is something that is always useful for me in identifying the actual problem statement of stakeholders. So yeah, there's still a lot more about problem solving, but I can't dig too deep into them now. But yeah, you can take note of the 5 whys. And then comes visualization. This is very important, and based on my experience, it's something that has really, really helped me also build my career, because I think it's a known fact that humans take in much more if they are more, like if they see something rather than just reading it. So for example, if I put all these information in a wall of text, you might be able to read them, but it might be harder to recall compared to, for example, a use case diagram, which is one of like my favorite ways to start analyzing processes. So you're able to identify the users. So they're obviously the ones that are represented by the stickman, and what their actions are, which are the ones in the circles. So from this point, you can already, like, it already makes sense that this is an online shopping system, because the customer can view items, make purchases, and do other things. But you are also able to identify the other users of the system that may be impacted by this online shopping system. So you would know, for example, from this example, that there is a service involved. There are some other like actual people who are identity providers, credit payment services, and even PayPal. So even here, the systems are laid out as users because they interact with the system. So it's really helpful, especially if you're still someone who's new, say, in the user story format. This actually really helped me before, because it's easier to transition to a user story. Because as a customer, I should be able to view items in order to blah, blah, blah. So it's easier for you to create the requirements themselves if you know what can be done in the which system and who does them. So very easy to understand if it's visual. And then, yeah, the next part, which I think is pretty much there ever since, like, in the beginning as a business analyst, is being able to create process flows. So there are a lot of ways, or lot of, like, starting points wherein you want to create a process flow. But for me, it's always being able to identify the as-is process and the to-be process. So hand in hand with knowing the correct techniques, if you're also able to visualize the processes, for example, if you shadowed someone, you don't just write down the process or, their tasks. You would be able to visualize it better if you could draw a process diagram for them. And because you can, or if you are able to identify and visualize the as-is and the to-be diagram, it would also be easier for you to perform gap analysis. So again, another topic on their own, but I just wanted to share really nice examples in case you don't know what process flow diagrams are. So on this part, on the left part, this is actually an example of a BPMN 2.0 process flow. So it's very rigid and standardized type of process flow, which usually, if you're documenting and sharing it with, say, regulatory bodies, usually it's in the BPMN format. But for me, I personally usually start with the one on the right, which is a regular process flow based on UML. This is basically the format that we also learned from high school, if you also started there. Something that's usually common, whatever process flow diagram you use, is that you will always have like an indicator wherein the process would start, where the process would end, representation of decisions, and of course the different steps of the process. So once you know those things and those representations, it's easier for you to understand as well. So for example, the one on the right is quite easy to understand because there is a phone call that was started, and you can just easily follow these things. And I think even in government offices, they have incorporated having these process flows so that if you're someone who comes in and wants to do a transaction, it's easy for you to know as well what you want to expect in the process. So it's always like the best part to start with, and like the meat of being a BA is being able to visualize processes as well. And the last one that I wanted to talk about is something that Adam also mentioned earlier. So it's about the journey mapping, or for me, I called it customer journey mapping. So if you were able to remember what Adam mentioned earlier, it's really about having an actual user, an end user of your system, and making sure that you consider their motivations, what happens to them while they undergo the process, and making sure that those user experience feedback that you might identify in this journey mapping is also considered in your requirements and part of the requirements that you manage. So I think Adam has went through the different steps. Just to recap, this is a bit different format, but it's basically the same. It has the same elements. So at the top, well, for this example at least, they also included information about the persona. And then you have the different steps. There are also phases, so like a different color would be a different phase in the process. And then you would have your different touch points. So for this part, I think they also made it visual, like how newbie Natalie would be feeling throughout the process. So you would know whether they're like going down or up. So again, visualization is always better. And then you would be able to identify also what the thoughts are of newbie Natalie while she undergoes the process of, what is this? Being a new patient. Wow, what a coincidence. So, coming into the hospital, and then undergoing the different procedures and stuff. So, yeah, it's very helpful because you always have these user requirements, the functional requirements, but sometimes user requirements would also involve experiences that weren't considered there before. Yeah. So visualizing and diagramming, they're really, really helpful as a BA, no matter how senior you are already. Yeah, and then there are also other formats or other diagrams that are useful. But I think that there's already too much that you can also, try to learn them by your own. But anything that involves process mapping, for example, I would really say that these two are the most helpful, UML and BPMN. And then making sure also that you consider your customer journey or your user journey, right? Okay, now I'm going to the last part, and honestly, one of the most challenging parts of being a BA, but you can't remove as part of, I would say this is also a core part of being a business analyst as well. It's making sure that you're able to manage your stakeholders. So again, stakeholders are people who have a stake on the project, product, or any solution that you're working on. So based on my experience, there have been many times wherein I thought, for example, that it would generally involve, say, one department of the company. But towards the end, once you've done your planning, your analysis, you will be able to identify that there are more relevant stakeholders than just the people that you initially talked to. And of course, they always want to be involved in the decisions that you're doing to their product because it impacts the processes that they own as well. So, for me, one of the things that have helped is being able to continuously update who your stakeholders are. And I mean, being able to sort of document who they are, what their stake on the, say, the solution is, what is their ask, for example, being able to relate the different requirements to the stakeholders as well. And especially if you know and you've noticed that the requirements are constantly evolving, which is also a known fact in life. So if they're evolving, so does your list of stakeholders. So there are times, especially when it comes to enterprises, if you're working on a big priority or a high priority project for your company, sometimes you would learn that, the CEO or the other C-suite level people have started to put direct stakes on the project and not just sponsor them. So you should be able to anticipate as well, like how high up does the value of this solution go. And you have to ensure that you have continuous engagement with these people, even if they may not be the type of stakeholders who, as much as you want to involve them because they're actually the ones who would be able to answer what the requirements are, but they're not just that engaged. You still have to put an effort and make sure that you continue at least reaching out to them. So we don't want to feed the zombies. It's something that here in OMB is like sort of our motto. But we also have to ensure that you don't sacrifice the value of the solution. That's why we have to make sure that we are engaging with our stakeholders because they're the ones who will be able to help us validate if the solution we are working on is actually valuable. And lastly, you will also have to always validate the requirements that you've gathered. It doesn't end at, making very colorful, very detailed process maps. It is a cycle, and for it to become a cycle and for it to be iterative, you have to validate the requirements that you have gathered. And to do that, of course, you will have to continuously engage with your stakeholders. So that's why it matters. And just to recap, those are just 4. And as I mentioned at the start, there are still more competencies in the business, being a business analyst. And, it would take probably not just a week to go through them. But these are the things, or these are the competencies that I think someone who wants to delve deeper into being a BA, build their career, claim to be a professional, could start with or could ensure that they have built their skills on these competencies already. So, some of those competencies, top of mind, that you could also build on would be solution design and evaluation. So, as a business analyst, it doesn't end at just gathering the requirements and just creating the processes. You're also involved in the solution itself. That's why you're part of the development team. And you're also someone who could help with the evaluation of the solution. And then there's also the business strategy assessment. So it's a bit highfalutin, but honestly, it's really more of knowing what the business strategy is, what their goals are, and being able to assess if it makes sense, if it does give value, anything that they want to change in their strategy. And of course, tools and technologies. So especially if you heard the opening remarks of from the DICT earlier, they did mention that we are hoping to delve deeper into, for example, cloud, information security. So it's also something that you could build on as a business analyst, knowing what these things are, what are the emerging trends, for example, what are the different tools that help you give more value to your team, and so on and so forth. And there are a lot more. There's honestly a lot more. And probably we could talk about them more in the future as well. But yeah, those 4 are the ones that I could include today. All right. So, of course, there's a lot of information that we've shared over the past few minutes, but something that, based on experience as well, I want everyone to watch out for. I'm saying this, of course, since I was a BA, but I think it applies to everyone. You have to always watch out for context switching, especially if you're responsible for solutions that are impacting multiple systems. Because I've been in a situation before wherein, as a business analyst and having been able to identify the different systems that would be impacted by the solution that I'm analyzing, I sort of dipped my toe into the world of the other systems as well, and ended up being like spread too thin over too many systems. So the ideal situation for a BA is that if you have something, if you're involved in a solution, make sure you focus there first. It's not a bad thing to be able to be knowledgeable about other systems as well, but you just have to make sure that, you're able to contribute valuable inputs and outputs as well, and not just being spread too thinly over many different aspects. And then it also happens usually if you're wearing multiple hats in one project. So if for example, even in an internal setup, which happened to me also before, because we ran out of project managers. This was like 5 years ago. I was supposedly a product owner, but I had to wear the hat of a business analyst as well. And then, of course, I had to wear the hat of a project manager for like the first few months of the engagement. And it was at the point of being unbearable already. So that's something that I think a BA should also watch out for. Why? Well, basically, if you're doing context switching, and this is also something that we usually, like is a common knowledge in the industry, if you're not like able to maintain that certain cadence or velocity of your thoughts, even if you're already doing documentation and you haven't gone that far yet into like making things tangible in a real document, and it's all in your mind, anytime that someone would ask you for help for another thing, it's not that easy to recall all of these things that you have already mapped in your mind. And speaking of hats, it is a fact, however, I know this is quite contradictory, but there are instances wherein you can wear many hats. So you can be a product owner, you can wear the hat of a product owner who is usually responsible for the definition of the requirements. Like they're usually the people we go to as BAs to know what the requirements are. And they're the ones who are usually responsible for backlog management. You can also be a project manager who is actually responsible for scope, resource, and timeline. And you can wear the hat of any stakeholder who wants to know more about the solution. But what I want to share before I end is that you can wear the hat, of course, if you want to consider, empathize with these different people. If you want to know how to provide like the best answers to any questions they may have, it's okay to wear the hat. But it's not necessary for you to take on the mantle, right? So if you're a BA, at least for me, if you want to focus on building your career, it's better to focus on being a business analyst at its core first, build those competencies, and then probably in the future you can jump into these different roles. But at least, especially if you're at your building phase of your foundations, it's not always necessary to take on the mantle. Otherwise, it would really burn you down faster. Right. And that's it for me. So I hope you had some takeaways from the session.